Modes of conscious relation. Distinct from the modes of conscious integration, are the modes of conscious relation. Conscious relation describes how one's consciousness processes the relationship between oneself and the other people and things in the world. Just as the hedonic response operates or manifests differently depending upon the mode of conscious integration, it is further modified by the mode of conscious relation. While all normal humans operate in the mode of conceptual integration, they can vary widely in their modes of conceptual relation. As one progresses from one mode of conscious relation to the next, one begins to reprogram one's narrow, default, and often limiting way of relating to the world, and begins to experience the world in an ever more expanded, free, and loving way. The progression from lower, or more restrictive, modes of conscious relation, to higher, or more expansive modes, is what is sometimes meant by the phrase, expansion of consciousness, or the freeing of one's mind. There are other types of consciousness expansion as well, such as that experienced when learning new things. For example, although all of these types of expansion of the mind tend to reinforce one another, such that expansion in one area tends to facilitate expansion in another. All consciousness expansion is beneficial and desirable. Methods for changing one's mode of conscious relation, or for expanding one's consciousness, will be described later in this writing. Driven consciousness. This is the default mode of conscious relation, the mode which humans are born into as children, and which many hardly ever escape. It is almost a sort of unconscious consciousness, in the sense that one is largely unconscious of the forces which drive one, or of the possibility of there being any alternative way of relating to the world. It is called the driven mode of conscious relation, because in this mode one is driven almost exclusively by one's hedonic, ego-based demands. This is appropriate for babies and small children, as such drives are a necessary survival mechanism. When hungry or otherwise dissatisfied, a baby cries for food, or whatever other needs it has. This is the proper behavior for a baby. As one gets older, however, it becomes possible to engage in proper survival activities, in a consciously conscious fashion, without being driven like an automaton, by the hedonic demands of one's ego. For most people, however, this mode remains their dominant way of relating to the world. In the driven mode of conscious relation, one is driven by ego-based, dualistic cravings, fears, hopes, pleasures, pains, and emotions. Life is characterized by incessant and often unpredictable swings between positive and negative emotions. These swings are typically very fast and extreme for babies and young children, who are often laughing one moment, crying the next, and then laughing again. Due to this, even the good times are often marred by the knowledge that things can change in an instant, causing anxieties or fears about the future. Even when the future seems rosy, it is always possible to generate an essentially endless array of new fears, or even to ruminate about undesirable events or conditions in the past. The driven mode of conscious relation is often characterized by dualistic types of thinking. This type of thinking is dominated by I versus other mental constructs, which set one against others and the world at large. In the game of me versus the world, there is only one me, but there will always be another you, or them, that needs to be feared, dominated, avoided, subdued, impressed, put down, seduced, or whatever one's ego-based demands require. Different people may be operating in the driven mode of conscious relation, but each may have a different particular focus. Some focus primarily on achieving physical or financial security, others may focus on achieving certain emotions, feelings, or sensations, others may focus on achieving social status and power. It is also common to seek forms of distraction or escape, often without realizing that this is what one is doing. This can come in many forms, such as drugs and alcohol, religious fantasies and prayer, sports, television, gambling, risky or unhealthy sexual activities, and so on. The list of such distractions and escapes is endless, and ultimately all are futile. While they may temporarily change one's focus or deaden one's mind, the underlying problem remains. One is living as a slave to one's own dualistic, hedonic, ego-based demands. Loving consciousness. As one moves into the mode of loving conscious relation, one begins to become consciously conscious of the hedonic, ego-based demands which have driven one's thoughts and behaviors. Just becoming conscious of this allows one to downgrade the power of these demands to mere preferences. It is called the mode of loving conscious relation, because in this mode one is beginning to relate to others, and even to events and conditions in the world, with real love and acceptance. This love and acceptance should not be misconstrued to mean that one simply settles for things as they are, never striving for forward-moving improvement. It simply means that one becomes less perturbed by things which do not meet one's preferences, and makes forward-moving improvements with an attitude of loving the process of improvement, without the need for anger, anxiety, disgust, jealousies, hatreds, or other negative feelings. The act of accepting or loving one's experiences, oneself, other people, and the world at large, allows one to escape from being driven by hedonic, ego-based, dualistic demands. One is able to see the world and oneself a bit clearer, and finds oneself free, or at least freer, from all sorts of negative emotions, and concomitantly freer in one's thoughts and actions. One may actually begin to associate with a wider variety of people, or engage in new activities, as one becomes free from one's previous and unnecessary ego-based drives. The loving mode of conscious relation is often characterized by a more unitary, or unifying, type of thinking, than the dualistic thinking of the driven mode of conscious relation. The adversarial relationship between oneself and others begins to fade, as one begins to see others as precious beings in their own right, each on his or her own path of growth and expanded consciousness. When one perceives that another is doing well on the path, one feels genuine happiness for that person. When one perceives that another is doing poorly on the path, one feels genuine compassion. One does not, however, get wrapped up in feelings of superiority or inferiority, regarding one's place on the path, in relation to anyone else. Part of accepting that which one would prefer to avoid, is also not being overly grasping of those things which one would prefer to attain. Instead, one adopts a more neutral internal response, both to that which is preferred, and to that which is not preferred. This puts one on more of a stable emotional path, rather than the emotional roller coaster which often characterizes the driven mode of conscious relation. The large upward and downward swings become more gentle rises and dips. As one's emotional track becomes more level and steady, one will naturally notice that, while the ups and downs are smoothed out, the baseline or the normal level of one's emotional state tends to gently increase over time. This increased freedom from ego-backed drives, and their resultant negative emotions, also gives one greater freedom and opportunity to enjoy positive emotions. Rather than constantly swinging between positive and negative emotions, life begins to take on a more steady glow of happiness. Normal moments, and the people and things around oneself, become infused with beauty. The longer one spends in the loving mode of conscious relation, the more one begins to sense that the world is providing one with, not only enough, but with an abundance. One begins to find that one no longer seeks out distractions and escapes, even as one may have certain unmet preferences. One gradually comes to see much of the world as a beautiful bounty. Observational consciousness. The longer one spends in the loving mode of conscious relation, the less that one gets caught up in the moment-to-moment dramas of life. One begins to experience one's own consciousness and life, as well as events in the external world, as a spectator or observer, from a calm, peaceful vantage point within one's mind. One still has preferences, and one still acts to achieve that which is preferred, and to avoid that which is not preferred, but with equanimity and emotional quietude. In the driven mode of conscious relation, everything is associated with some judgment as to whether it accords or conflicts with one's hedonic, ego-based demands. In the loving mode of conscious relation, this is alleviated somewhat as judgments take on a more loving aspect, and as the power of ego-based demands are downgraded to preferences. In the observational mode of conscious relation, however, judgments have less experiential significance. Judgment and preference still take place and are observed as such, but without necessitating a stirring of the emotions. This points to an important fact: biological drives and judgments of all sorts are necessary to further one's survival, and to advance the conditions of one's life, and those of one's loved ones. This is an inescapable part of human life. When operating in the observational mode of conscious relation, however, drives, preferences and judgments are noted and heeded as may be necessary, but are calmly observed as happenings within one's mind, without eliciting emotional reactions. Just as occurs in the loving mode of conscious relation, the freedom from emotional swings puts one on an emotional even keel, and over time one's baseline emotional state steadily rises, providing a quiet, still and fulfilling sense of contentment, happiness, and well-being. Even this increase in one's baseline emotional state is not actively judged, however, but serenely experienced and observed, as part of the playing out of one's here and now life and conscious experience. Unitary consciousness. The driven, loving and observational modes of conscious relation are each characterized by some level of subject-object duality. One experiences oneself as separate from the rest of the world. It is fairly obvious to see how this is the case in the driven mode, as one is constantly being pushed and pulled by all sorts of external stimuli and conditions. These are experienced as drivers, with oneself as the driven. The loving mode continues this experience of duality, as things are essentially experienced in the dualistic sense of lover and loved. The observational mode also retains this duality, with the duality now being experienced as observer and observed. In the mode of unitary consciousness, however, the experience of duality and separation vanishes. One experiences oneself, the world, and all the things which one encounters in it, as essentially a unitary happening. In the unitary mode, one is still an observer, but the observation of one's inner world and the outer world are no longer differentiated as being self and other, but are experienced as a single, all-encompassing flow. It can be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to communicate the experience of unitary conscious relation to someone who has not personally experienced it, much like trying to describe the experience of red to a blind person. The hedonic, ego-based demands of the driven mode are absolutely abolished. One has completely transcended the drive towards pleasure, and away from pain, and instead experiences the sublime and ineffable pleasure of freedom from the drive for pleasure, so to speak. This is a most profound type of freedom. Even the preference-based thoughts and actions of the dualistic loving and observational modes essentially vanish, to be replaced by a deep, profound, natural flow of wisdom and love. The unitary mode is extraordinarily rare. There are billions of individuals on Earth, yet there are perhaps only some tens of thousands or so who have experienced it at all. Something like 0.001% of all humanity. Even rarer are those who have developed the ability to experience this mode of conscious relation on a recurring basis. Perhaps only several hundred or so. The most rare, of course, are those dozens, or maybe few hundreds, who consistently experience this sublime state. Specific techniques will be presented later in this exposition, for moving up from driven, to loving, to observational, and finally to unitary consciousness. As stated, however, unitary consciousness is extremely rare, so one should not be discouraged by its elusive nature. The joy, harmony, wisdom, and love experienced by living in the loving and observational modes, provide more than a wealth of fulfillment, even if one never experiences the unitary mode at all, yet they also do provide the perfect springboard, for possibly catapulting one into unitary consciousness.
Thank you for watching. Please help spread our message by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to our channel. Please also visit our website, Scionics.org, and register to join the Scio-Society for free. You can also help support our cause directly, by donating through our website. We sincerely hope you will be a part of our effort to bring about the positive revolutionary transformation of the Scionics protocols.